Welcome. Hello to the first of these conversations for this, my final year in college. Delighted to have Gillian Tett with us today, who is the new provost at King's, a former student at Clare, I think.
That's right, yes.
So let me start off by asking you about your roots. You were born and brought up in North London.
Yes, I grew up partly in London and partly in Devon. I have to admit that my heart is really in Devon. That's where a lot of my family came from. As a small child, we actually lived in Australia for quite a long time. And interestingly enough, when I applied to do Arc and Anth, or Anthropology at Cambridge, they actually asked me in the interview, had I, travelled anywhere else or lived anywhere else when I was young, because they were doing a survey and discovered that many of the people who are interested in culture and anthropology have, for some reason, been tossed across cultural borders when they're young. But I grew up mostly in London as a teenager and spent a gap year in Pakistan and then came to Cambridge.
So, any anthropologists in your family?
No anthropologists in my family. I became, I think, interested in culture initially, partly because, I guess I moved between Australia and England when I was young. Also because my own family was grappling with that great cultural chasm in the UK known as the class system. And I had, one part of my family which were, upwardly mobile and wonderful Devonshire farmers and things like that. Another part which were seriously downwardly mobile because they were part of that, part of the English system which had once been aristocratic and gambled and drank it all away. And they sort of collided in the middle. But like many people, I grew up navigating different types of social codes. And I think that's one thing that made me fascinated in culture.
So one thing Gillian and I have already discovered, we went to rival stroke sister schools. Gillian went to North London Collegiate for Young Ladies and I went to Camden School for Girls.
And yours was infinitely trendier. Let me tell you, when I was growing up, you were the cool kids. Times 10. We were the very earnest, geeky ones who kind of wore a disgusting brown uniform.
Ours was green.
Exactly, which put me off brown for life, I think. But you were definitely the cool kids because you were living in cool Camden and we were in Stanmore.
At the end of the Northern Line, yes. I'm not sure, I'm a bit before your time, and we were fairly cool.
You were incredibly cool.
I wasn't, but they were.
Well, you're cool by association.
But of course, it was the Victorian ideal. I mean, it's very much the negotiating class, because Camden was definitely a school founded for the tradesmen's daughters.
Yeah, well, in my case, it's actually more different because actually I grew up out of London. Again, it's a story which, is really of its age. I grew up out of London in the suburbs, way out in the suburbs. And I came from, a wonderful, wonderful mother who I just loved to bits, but who'd left school at 16 because the kind of family she came from, girls didn't really do much. They were expected to go off and play at being a secretary and then get married or be a chalet girl or something like that. Anyway, so, all of the focus when I was growing up, quite naturally, was actually on my brother academically. And then when I was about 11, I started playing truant. And I'll never forget this because the school called my parents in and said in a state of great embarrassment, we've worked out what the problem is with Gillian. We think she might be clever. And apparently my mother said, oh, what should we do about that? And they said, well, you could try sending her to another school for clever girls. And so I was dispatched. I mean, I literally, in those days, I didn't do any entrance exams apart from this one. I was dispatched off to do the entrance for the school called North London Collegiate. I think they literally opened the book and said, where should we send her? And I got in. And it turned out I was the only girl in the class who came from that area. And that probably turned me into an anthropologist as well, because it was amazing. I mean, it was an incredible school founded by Frances Mary Buss at a time when it wasn't fashionable to educate girls, and very much focused on trying to instill ambition. And it was the first time in my life I'd actually met girls who had mothers who worked. And it was just incredible. And it's one reason why I'm so passionate about trying to have a demonstration effect for girls and boys, anyone, show people what's possible. Because if I hadn't seen that at a fairly young age, I don't think I would have realised all the opportunities were out there.
And would you have gone on playing truant?
I don't know what I would have done. I probably would have done, yes.
I mean, were you bored? Was that the point?
I was just, bored like lots of kids. I'm a great fan of, when kids start misbehaving in school, often it's worth asking, what's actually going on underneath it all. But anyway, it's a great school. I was extremely lucky. I didn't have a particularly distinguished school career, but I really enjoyed it. And and then ended up having a gap year and then coming to Cambridge.
And could they encourage you in your desire to do anthropology? Did it mean anything to the teachers?
No. The anthropology was entirely me, because my father was sort of baffled by what on earth I was going to do. And so he said to me, maybe you should become an accountant. And I went, no. And I think I pretty much opened the book. Oh, anthropology, great. And,
so you didn't get beyond A.
More seriously, I just desperately wanted to travel the world. Right. And I was desperately curious about what made people tick and their different cultural patterns.
I mean, culture, you'd include class in that, presumably.
Yeah, and one of the things I loved about anthropology, and I still love about anthropology, is that, anthropologists are really curious about what makes people tick and what drives them, but for the most part, without a sense of judgment. And it's just saying, listen, there's lots of different ways that people operate and think and speak and behave, and we all have weird assumptions, and every single human being is tribal in some way. And it's not a case of, putting it on some kind of ranking or anything like that. It's just different, and being open to cultural differences and trying to understand it. And the core of anthropology is that you want to embrace cultural difference and be curious about others who seem alien from you, not just so you can understand other people, but most importantly, so that the act of trying to think yourself into the minds of someone who seems alien and different, that allows you to then look back at yourself more objectively and see how fundamentally weird you are. It's true, we're all weird. Everyone's weird.
No, I accept that, yes, and Cambridge colleges are weird.
Deeply weird. Yeah, everyone's weird, and we can't run away from it. We're all weird and exotic to someone else. We all are hardwired to assume that we are normal, and the nature of being human is we all think we're normal, everyone else is weird, the way we are is permanent and timeless, and so everyone else should basically be like us. Why aren't they? That's a basic human condition. And as an anthropologist, you plunge into other cultures, and whether it's, whether you come from a working class background, and you're looking at sort of, posh people, or posh people looking at working class people in an English context, or Northern, or Southern, or French and English, or any other type of cultural difference. We don't need to we should never ever rank them at all, even though as humans we tend to. We should always be open to learning from others of whatever background they come from, and always do that, realizing that fundamentally we're totally weird, and we should be humble about that.
And you would therefore distinguish it very much from being a sociologist, where the sociologist thinks they know how other people should live their life.
I would do, actually, yes.
Yes. I mean, listening to you, that seems to me the difference that a sociologist is going to say.
Well, the other difference between sociologists, again, all these labels are blurring a lot these days. But a sociologist historically tended to look more at the Western world rather than the non-Western world.
Yes.
Traditionally, that has now broken down a lot. But sociologists also tend to start with a macro picture and then drill down, whereas anthropologists, are there any anthropologists in the room?
Yeah.
Yay! Great. Well, you can tell me whether you agree with what I'm saying or not, but anthropologists tend to look bottom up, and they tend to look at all the interconnections. So if you're a sociologist looking at religion traditionally, you would study, the nature of Church of England attendance in England, and then drill down from that, often with big data sets. If you're an anthropologist looking at religion in England, you'd probably go and just sit in a parish church for a year and observe, and look not just at the church, but everything else that was linked around it, and all the stuff that people didn't define as being the church, but was actually part of the fabric. And it's just different perspectives. Now, that very crude distinction I've made is breaking down very rapidly, partly because of the rise of big data and things like that. But that was traditionally the distinction. And another way to put it is anthropology is the perfect excuse to be incredibly nosy.
And people will let you be?
Well, they won't always let you be. I mean, again, historically, when anthropology started, in the Victorian era, it was basically rooted in pretty disgusting power structures. And it was really fundamentally very imperialist, racist, and sexist. And it came out of the British Empire and came out of other empires, which was all about, initially, for the most part, mostly Victorian white men going to peer at, people who they considered to be inferior to try and sort of track them and chart them. That was the first wave of anthropology. And, as a discipline, we have to own that. It was pretty disgusting.
Yeah, that's where they're all the shriveled heads. And
Yeah. And then in the 1930s, it did a complete U-turn. And it went from being, or part of it did, from being this very imperialist, sexist, racist discipline to becoming arguably the branch of the social science which was most in favor of relativism and saying, actually, cultures are different, but it's a spectrum, it's not clear-cut boxes, and we can all learn from each other with a spirit of humility. And people like Boas, who was one of the founding fathers of anthropology, campaigned against the rise of Nazism to the point that, his were the books which were some of the first to be thrown in the fire during the book burning of the Nazis. And it was a really radical intellectual flip. Now, it's taken a long time for the fruits of that to become clear. But one of the things that's happened as a result of that flip is that anthropologists today look as much as Western societies as non-Western. Again, in a spirit of humility and a need to all learn from each other.
so when you were
But I would not pretend, by the way, that anthropology is a perfect discipline. It's very imperfect in lots of ways.
Well, I was just going to ask you what you were taught. Were you still taught an imperialist form, or?
No, we weren't taught an imperialist form. We were taught, we went through the classics, and then some of you may be studying that now, and some of the classics were pretty old school. And then we sort of went into the more modern era. I was someone who was deeply influenced by the works of Pierre Bourdieu, and Bourdieu remains my intellectual lodestar. So that, for me, was really a defining moment. But, one of the problems was that I was doing anthropology during the time of my PhD in a lot of postmodernist times, when anthropologists had gone so far with the idea of relativism that everything was considered to be viewed in a totally subjective way through a kind of so-called dirty lens. And so a lot of anthropology monographs of the time were very so self-referential and so reflective. They were more about the anthropologist than what they were looking at. And I found that quite frustrating.
Right. Now, I'm going to throw something in with some trepidation. So my mother left school at 14, I should say. But 14, there was also this background. My great.
So how did you get to go?
Well, no. Hang on. Let me get.
I'm curious about you. I want to be nosy about you.
Okay. So my great-great-uncle was E.B. Taylor.
Oh, wow.
And I don't think he was as imperialist.
Maybe not.
And I mean, I talked to Marilyn Strathern about this. I was trying to justify my family.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing about him and my grandfather's family was that they were Quakers. Mm. And that seemed highly relevant, that he was not brought up in the high church tradition, let's go and educate the natives kind of thing. And he was sent to Mexico because he had, was thought to have TB. I don't think he can have done. He lived to be a ripe old age. But reading a bit about him, it seems to me that he was probably resisting the imperialists.
Yeah, there was actually, I was slightly crunching down the story because I tend to assume people aren't interested in this. But it's actually in my last book in some detail. I mean, to get geeky about it, in the 19th century, there were actually 2 anthropologist societies in London. One of them was called the Cannibals Club. I kid not. And they were utterly racist and imperialist. And, they actually hung a skeleton at one point outside their window. And they were all about, literally classifying different races according to, the worst of eugenics and stuff. The other group, though, were actually coming from a Quaker and abolitionist tradition. And they were passionately in favour of both abolitionist ideals, but also in favour, very strongly in favour, of not trying to classify races in that way. And there was a huge showdown, and if anyone's interested in this, the history of the Cannibal Club is fascinating. There was a huge showdown where they actually had a very, an African actually came to one of the societies to argue their cause, and it was very dramatic. And in the end, the two societies merged, and it watered down the Cannibal Club ideals, or not ideals, the horrible ideas, but it never really got to the kind of state that I think probably people like the Quakers would have wanted.
Right, okay.
So that's a kind of in a nutshell. And again, that's a classic example of, not trying to stereotype people in the way I did.
Right, well, I'm glad I knew enough to challenge you on that. That's the limit of my anthropology, I have to say. So you...
And I won't try and challenge you on your physics. I think
we could talk about Bruno Latour if you wanted, but...
I think it's going to be a slightly unequal contest, but yes.
You did a PhD, and that sent you to Kazakhstan?
No, what happened was, it happened to me to Tajikistan. What happened was in my year off, between school and university, I went to Pakistan and spent a year working on a medical program, and I learned Urdu while I was there. And in the first 2 summers in college, I went off to Tibet. I became very, very absorbed in Tibetan culture. I actually was studying Tibetan and wanted to go and do my PhD in Tibet. And then Tiananmen Square happened. Oh. And so I couldn't. And I was extraordinarily lucky because Caroline Humphrey, who is a wonderful, wonderful fellow at King's, I think literally bumped into me and said, have you thought about going to the Soviet Union? Because at the very time that China was shutting down because of Tiananmen Square, the Soviet Union was just starting to open up because of glasnost and perestroika. And so I looked at different parts of the Soviet Union, looked at originally Buryatia and Tuva, because Mongolian was linked to Tibetan. Then I couldn't do that, and I looked at Sakhalin, and almost went to Sakhalin. I'm really glad I didn't, because in fact amazing Korean anthropologist went instead of me, and apparently it was really cold, and they worked in a fish canning factory for a year, and everyone was drunk, so I dodged that one. And I went to Tajikistan in the end because Urdu and Tajik is connected a bit, so that was why.
So how many languages do you speak?
Not very many now, properly. Oh. So I speak about 3-4 now, properly, but I've studied a lot, but not well.
Because I read Anthrovision, and you went practically not being able to speak. Is that right?
Yeah, I studied Russian very intensively because in those days the only way that you could get into the Soviet Union was through a exchange program with the British Council, and a condition of that was to be enrolled in the Soviet Academy. So I was technically enrolled in a Soviet PhD program, what they called in Russian aspirantka, and it had never happened before. So I was a guinea pig in Tajikistan, but it meant I was given a supervisor, and I had to go to lectures, and I had to read a lot of Soviet anthropology. So I literally learnt to read Russian and do that by reading endless texts on the Communist Party and saying things like, we must fulfill the 5-year plan and things like that.
Okay, and Soviet anthropology, what was that like?
That was fascinating because almost completely unknown to Western anthropologists, an entire school of anthropology had grown up in the Soviet Union from the 1920s. And it was driven by a lot of the same ideas as Victorian anthropologists, which is the Russian anthropologists said, well, we've got these weird people on the edges of our empire, and we don't know what the hell they're doing. We want to understand them, and we want to persuade them to become more like us. So they borrowed lock, stock, and barrel the ideas of 19th century anthropologists at the very moment that Western anthropologists were discarding them. And they embraced evolutionary social frameworks 100%. So they literally devised charts of all the peoples of the Soviet Union and put them on a kind of evolutionary framework as to who was more advanced than not. And what anthropologists in the Soviet Union were basically expected to do was go and observe all of the minorities and work out how advanced they were, and then study their strange rituals so that they could basically chart them as a kind of exotic curiosity. And out of this drive emerged this huge frenetic academic activity, which went on for decades. And, having been raised in Cambridge anthropology and assuming that it was self-evidently the only thing that anthropology could be, to be plunged into another discipline which had the same name, but a really different starting point, was fascinating because, on one level I arrived and thought, this is just ridiculous. I'm totally scornful. But on another level, it taught me something really important, which is that academics will create this intellectual framework that they assume is correct and self-evidently permanent. And actually, epistemology varies. And even academics who scurry for years working in fields which seem completely natural, self-evident and correct may actually be caught up in their own environment and creatures of their own intellectual environment in a way that seems weird to outsiders. So I always try, if I can, to have a bit of humility about my own epistemology, partly because of that. Not because I thought the Soviet anthropology was correct, but because it showed me there's always, nobody has a monopoly on the truth.
But you said that their anthropology was rather like the Western Victorian one. So,
well, there were many things that were wrong about it, but actually Ernest Gellner, who was head of the Department of Anthropology when I was doing my PhD and was at King's, he wrote extensively about this. He was about the only other person who was immersed in Soviet anthropology, apart from Caroline Humphrey. And, he pointed out there were some elements of Soviet anthropology which actually were interesting as ideas that we could learn from too. Much of it may not have been ideas we wanted to embrace, but,
And has it changed now?
No, it basically collapsed. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the whole discipline collapsed for the most part. But tragically, one of the awful ghastly ironies is that today it's infinitely more important because you have a situation where for the first time ever, people are trying to confront Russian imperialism head on. They're looking at the really ugly aspects of that. Anybody who was working around the edges of the Soviet Union always knew about that. I mean, I've actually got a Tajik friend staying with me at the moment who's been at Cambridge writing her PhD on aspects of this. And as she said to me, basically, this has always been present as an underbelly and no one ever talked about it, but it was always there. But now for the first time, because of Ukraine, because of what's been happening in the Caucasus, people are really talking about, we need to think about what is this entity and what is the relationship between Russian imperialism and the others, and how is this shaping and defining different senses of national identity.
And you think anthropology could help the West confront?
Well, I think it can help the West, but I think it actually could help, in the future, I hope, both Russians and, most importantly, non-Russians to think about their own identity in the framing of that.
Oh, okay, you're pushing it back onto them. It's not how
I'm talking about both.
Right. So what did you...
I'm going to give you a tiny example. There's an absolutely brilliant book by someone at the Mongolian Studies Centre here in Cambridge. It's called something very attention-grabbing, like The Secret Sexual History of Mongolians. But it's actually not. It's actually a very, very thoughtful book about sexuality in Mongolia for the last, 8-10 centuries. And they point out, by looking at this as an anthropologist, that so many of the current tropes in modern Mongolian society about defining female and male gender roles are actually functions of an attempt to create a new form of nationalism. And if you go back and look historically at how Mongolian society lived before, it's quite different. Women had far more rights before than they're currently portrayed. And that's a kind of cultural wrinkle and debate which can be, and should be incorporated, into how people in Mongolia today see their society and their identity. And they should not just, accept what was handed down to them by the communist regime.
And so before they were absorbed into...
Yeah.
Right. So in Anthrovision, you talk about how every big company should employ anthropologists to help them understand their practices?
I would say every big institution. It's not just about companies.
Okay.
Or profession, actually.
Right.
And it's actually more about, I'm not trying to do a sort of one-woman job creation scheme for anthropologists, although I'm fully in favour of that. What I'm actually trying to do is, I passionately believe that the three-part journey, which I think is at the core of anthropology as I see it, namely that you try and make the strange familiar, you deliberately try and get out of your comfort zone and think yourself into the mind of someone who's different to understand them and realize that your point of view is not universal. Duh. That's the first stage. So you make the strange familiar, and then you try and flip the lens and make the familiar strange and look back at yourself as they might see you, and then try and use that insider-outsider perspective to look at what Bourdieu called social silences, the parts of the world that you take for granted, your assumptions. I believe that three-part journey is critical for anybody in whatever profession they're in.
So could you, without turning everyone into anthropologists,
I'll convert you all now if you want.
Well, fine, but we still need physicists. But could you put several modules into an MBA, say? Would that be sufficient?
I think you could, could you? Yeah, actually I do. Now I know that some anthropologists might feel very offended by that because they might feel that was trivializing or sensationalizing anthropology, turning into pop anthropology. And I know that as someone who, is an amateur, I'm not an academic, I haven't done what many of you have done, which is to spend years and years and years in the academy developing my specialty. I know that to many people who have done that, what I do is very, very shallow and trivial. And I totally acknowledge that. I would never call myself an anthropologist, academic anthropologist, because, I do it in an amateur way, frankly, and with enormous respect for people in the academy. But having said, I think there's a place for the academy. However, I also think there's a desperate need today for people in the academy to find ways to communicate their ideas to the wider world, even if that means engaging in a bit of pop anthropology, if you like, or trying to crunch those ideas down. I know it's controversial, but I do think the ideas in anthropology, like almost every other discipline here, are so critical, and we have to find ways to communicate them, that's something I think could and should be done.
Yes, I suppose that wasn't quite what I was trying to ask. We are going to have people do MBAs. We're going to have people who lead companies. And would they be better leaders, say?
Absolutely.
Better politicians, heaven help us.
Absolutely.
So that I don't think that's a commentary on academia per se.
Yeah, I'm trying to say more for business.
Horizons.
What happens in business is that in order to climb the ladder of a corporate hierarchy, you normally have to be incredibly focused, and you have to basically often have tunnel vision. And you have to usually master some kind of skill or profession that takes a very long time to master. And you get very, very busy. And if you're successful, you often get busier and you get validated in whatever narrow skill set you have. And all of that is fantastic for being promoted, and is often fantastic for innovating and leading and growing things. That's brilliant. But it creates tunnel vision, or it creates an assumption that I look at the world this way, so everyone else should too. And almost every single example of bad behavior or stupid behavior I've ever seen in the corporate world, or frankly in the government world, by leaders, usually occurs not because they're deliberately evil and they mean to blow up the world, but because they've become so captured by tunnel vision. They can't see themselves as others would see them, and they end up missing really obvious risks. They get stuck in a corner office and then can't see around the corners.
Okay. Well, you haven't been in Cambridge long enough probably to work out if that applies to academics as well. But
Absolutely not. I'm sure all the academics in Cambridge got fantastic lateral vision, I'm sure.
In certain directions, maybe. So how did you come with?
But I'll give you a tiny example of that, because after I joined the Financial Times and I became a journalist, I spent years and years, writing about all kinds of sectors. But the financial crisis was the absolute epitome of that, because what happened there was you had these highly paid, incredibly intelligent, mostly young innovators who developed this set of tools to slice and dice debt into new financial instruments and then trade them. And when they created these tools, they had this sort of creation mythology, which I think they half believed, which was said that it's going to be good for the whole world because slicing and dicing debt is going to make the cost of borrowing cheaper, and don't we all want cheap mortgages? And they embarked on that very rapidly, and it sort of grew and grew and grew, and they became very successful, and they became consumed by what they were doing, and they completely lost sight of what was happening at the end of their food chain. They had tunnel vision, not lateral vision, and they couldn't see that all this slicing and dicing was distorting the cost of borrowing and creating credit bubbles and causing some really, really crazy things to happen, because they just weren't being anthropologists and looking at the end of the food chain of this financial thing. So if any of you have you seen the movie The Big Short after the financial crisis? There's that wonderful scene where the hedge fund traders go down to Florida and they meet a lap dancer who's taken out subprime mortgages. And the hedge fund traders have been creating these instruments with subprime mortgages. And so they ask her what she's doing with it. And she says, she's got 12 properties or something. And they go, "You've done what?" And you suddenly realized that what was shocking was not the fact that what people were doing with the mortgages. What was shocking was that people who were in the engine room of finance doing all this stuff didn't have enough curiosity or time or ability to actually see what was happening at the grassroots of the other end. So whereas an anthropologist was actually on the ground trying to understand it, they were kind of a bit like the philosophers in Plato's cave, who could see shadows of reality flickering on their walls or on their computer screens, and they weren't actually getting out and seeing what was happening on the ground. And to give you an example of why the models blew up so badly, which was supposed to predict the default rate on mortgages, and I won't get too geeky and financial about this, but until about 2003 in America, the pattern for defaults was almost always that people would default first on their credit cards if they ran out of money, then their auto loans, and then their houses. So all the models predicting defaults were based on that kind of waterfall structure. And then sometime around 2003, 4, 5, that flipped. And when people in America began to run out of money, they defaulted first on their homes, and then on their cars, and then on their credit cards. And the reason was that it became culturally acceptable to default on a house and walk away. And people realized that if you didn't have a house, if you had a car, you could still sleep in it. And they also realized you couldn't do anything without a credit card. Now, that was a really subtle cultural shift that no one who was an economist or financier trapped in their little office could see. You had to be on the ground level. Yeah. And what fascinates me today is actually, if you're an economist, if you've got any economists in the crowd, variants of this are happening today in terms of how people treat jobs, how they make spending decisions, what they're spending money on. All kinds of cultural shifts are underway right now, which are changing the patterns of how we behave, that you cannot capture if you have a model which is based on behavior that happened in the past and top down.
And I want to get back to...
And as a physicist, you should feel really angry, because what happened is that in about 1989 or 85, 89, economics and finance borrowed the models from old-fashioned Newtonian physics. They didn't even get up to relativity.
Very mechanical.
Mechanical. And they used that to take past data and predict the future. And it was completely wrong. And then everyone turned around and blamed physics.
well, the economists have to get out of it somehow. What about behavioural economists, though? Are they as bad?
No, listen, I don't like what happened before 2007 and 8. Behavioral economics was basically in the tribal structure of economics, somewhere near pond life. They were literally at the bottom.
Yes.
There's a wonderful economist called Axel Lenhofeld who wrote an amazing essay in 1970 called Life Amongst the Econ. And if there's any economists in the room who haven't read it, I would urge you to go and read it, because he's actually a grown-up economist, very esteemed economist, but he wrote about the economics profession as if he was an anthropologist amongst the Eskimos, or they're not called Eskimos now. And he pointed out that economists had tribal patterns, and the macroeconomics who dealt with models were top, the orthodox economics, and the people who did sort of behavioral economics were down the bottom. And that's how it was ranked. And after 2007 and 8, that changed. And suddenly behavioral economics became quite cool. Not as cool as Camden Girls, but
They don't all wear Doc Martens, as you put it.
No.
So how did you go from being a PhD anthropologist to working for the FT?
Briefly, I did my fieldwork research, finished it in what I thought I had no idea was the last year of the Soviet Union. And my entire PhD was all about the Soviet system. So I was heavily invested in the continuation of the Soviet Union. That was literally my subject. And I went back to England, and I'd always vaguely wondered if I might want to be a journalist, but didn't have the courage to try. But somehow I wangled my way to get a internship for 2 or 3 weeks at the FT foreign desk in London. And by an absolute act of the gods, on my second week, the first Soviet coup happened. And it was August, every single senior journalist in the FT was on holiday. There was no one in the building who spoke Russian. And I'd been making the coffee until then. And I put my hand up and said, I speak Russian, can I write a piece? And they kind of went, okay, fine, yeah, whatever. And in the course of 2 or 3 days, I went from making the coffee to writing pieces. And then a foreign editor came out and said, shouted across the desk, we think there's going to be a revolution in Lithuania tomorrow. Does anyone want to go? And I put my hand up and said, I'll go. And I wasn't quite sure exactly, I had no idea how to get there. And he went, fine, okay, great. And so I literally, next day, I went to Lithuania. And in those days, getting to Lithuania was really hard. So I had to fly to West Berlin, take a taxi to East Berlin, fly across. I had no visa. I had $1,000 of cash. And I landed in Vilnius, and they said, where's your visa? And I said, but you're independent now, give me a Lithuanian one. And they went, oh, good point. So they literally wrote a bit of paper, a Lithuanian visa. And sadly, I threw it away. If I'd framed it, I could have sold it.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that was the start. And so I then spent several months writing as a journalist. Tragically, the community that I worked with in Tajikistan, the country descended into extreme violence and pogroms. And so the community I've been living with, a lot of very bad things happened. And I then became very exercised by the idea of trying to write about this really as much from a human rights perspective as anything. So I became basically, effectively a war reporter for quite a long time. And I was sent from horrible part of the Soviet Union to horrible part of the Soviet Union. And the rest is history.
But what that shows, we have, I think, some students in the audience.
What it shows is always put your hand up first and then think about how to do it later.
And that luck is really relevant. And I think in academia, people are very inclined to say, of course, I was so clever. Maybe luck they don't say that in the journalism world so much. I don't know, but luck is absolutely fundamental to most people's success.
Luck is huge. Luck is huge, and I am deeply. I guess I'd say 3 things. Firstly, luck is huge, and I never for a millisecond think I got to where I got to by some, genius stroke or anything like that. I just got really lucky.
You were in the right place at the right
Exactly.
time and had the courage.
And I'm very grateful for that.
You had the courage to leap
But the second
into
thing is
unknown.
I'm passionately in favour of teaching kids to hustle no matter what. You've got nothing to lose.
Yes.
And if it doesn't work the first time, keep trying, keep trying. It took me 11 times before I got my first article published in the FT. Because the reason I got an internship at the FT was I'd actually been pitching them with ideas for the weekend FT section. And I literally gave them 11 articles before they took one. So just keep going over and over and over again. Because most people I know who've got anywhere important have done it because they've had to go back over and over again, and don't take no for an answer. And one of the things that, I think that, I just can't stress that strongly enough to keep going. It's really important. And I do believe in just trying to say yes and working out how to do it afterwards. I'm a passionate fan of internships.
Yes, and they paid you, I hope.
It was kind of irrelevant because they gave me some money, but actually the Soviet Union was in such chaos that, they sort of paid me, but not really. But not today,
Yeah, we should never accept unpaid internships. We probably should throw it open to questions, and that is as much for the people online. If you type your questions into the Q&A, I can see them, and I have my glasses so I can read them too. And Annabelle has the microphone if we have questions from the floor. There's one there. Oh, lots of questions. That's good. Let's start with that one.
I await detailed inquisition about the Cannibals Club. Not.
Hi, Dr. Gillian. I was there at the event this evening when you launched the ITE, so very inspiring to hear from you. You spoke about communication a few times. Mm-hmm. You spoke about, how we should communicate from academic to the outside world. I actually came from Southeast Asia. I came to Cambridge 3 months ago, and I'm very curious, how can someone like me from business and marketing try to understand more about, what's happening in the AI and then communicate back that to my community who is in business?
Well, that's a longer topic, but if you're trying to communicate complicated ideas, the things I'd say is, first of all, recognize that people, for the most part, can't take in more than 3 or 4 points if you're trying to communicate them. Recognize that human stories are always what communicates most effectively. There's a reason why we have these Hollywood biopics, or, the Bible has human parables and things like that. So always try and find some element of a human aspect, if you possibly can. If you're dealing with numbers or abstract ideas, always try and turn them into some kind of image, because for most people that will stick easier in the head. The best way to communicate the complexities of the financial system is to either talk about plumbing and explain what happens if it goes wrong, and no one wants to talk about it most of the time, but actually that's what money systems are like. They're like plumbing. Or to, I sometimes talk about, when slicing and dicing mortgages is like creating sausages. You take bits of meat from all over the place, put them together, and if you have a food poisoning scare and you think that one part of the sausage, i.e. the loans, have gone wrong and you can't tell what it is, everyone panics. There's kind of simple metaphors. The one other thing I'd say is I'm a passionate fan of what I call the domino effect of communication. And I don't mean dominoes in the sense of dominoes toppling over in a row. I mean that the game of dominoes is that basically you take a plastic piece with 2 numbers and you match one number up with someone else's number. But the second part of your domino can be an entirely different domino. And if you are trying to communicate an alien idea to somebody else who knows nothing about it, try and start by connecting your domino with their domino somehow, and then you can take them somewhere completely different. So I did that with my last book with Anthropology, in that most people, who know nothing about anthropology, think of Margaret Mead, or think of, it's like Indiana Jones for grown-ups kind of thing. And what I did by going to Tajikistan is your popular image of anthropology. So that's how I kind of communicate it initially. But actually, what I've done using my anthropology skills is mostly related to looking at the City of London or Silicon Valley which is not the popular image of anthropology at all. So I try and talk to people about anthropology, first with Tajikistan, but then I say, but actually, I then use those skills to look at it in relation to Silicon Valley. And they often go, where? Really? That's kind of weird. Or, and I say, well, actually, this exactly the same mental process I use to deconstruct Tajik wedding rituals work totally relevant for looking at investment banking conferences or big tribal gatherings of coders in Silicon Valley. It's literally the same thing. And so I think if you're trying to communicate complex or alien ideas or talk to people who you think are probably going to hate your ideas, and this is really relevant in the current political climate, thinking about the domino, start with something that connects you and then take them somewhere else as a new bit of information.
There was a question just in front, and then we'll take the next one.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. Really enjoyed it. So I have a couple of questions, one related to business and other related to politics. So you spoke about the importance of anthropology in business. Just curious regarding the mindset of leaders. Do you think today's business are taking anthropologies as very important and having one of anthropologist mindset in the board and trying to drive the business forward and in this today's sustainable world, trying to do things better and for the betterment of the world? So that's my first question. How do you think, on your experience, do you think where the business are giving importance to anthropology? And the second is related to politics, where you mentioned about the identity. And I'm just curious, even in one of your recent article where you spoke about the Trump coming back to the US. So more I'm also reading articles where today's politics world is driven towards identity politics, like make America first again, and like the Brexit and the other countries are looking at.
Right. Okay.
So yes, and how does the anthropology come in, and do you think we can coexist and live together? And
so it's a way of saying, what's the point of anthropology? Can it actually tell us how business works and how politics work in a way? Okay, on the business thing, can anthropology help? The answer is yes, no, yes. Or rather, is our businesses using anthropologists? The answer is yes, no, yes. Yes, a number of companies, particularly in the consumer goods sector and the tech sector, have used anthropology insights and anthropologists to try and understand their consumers better and to deal with them more effectively. That is controversial in the world of anthropology. Some anthropologists would say that actually any anthropologists working for tech companies are creating a new form of imperialism and helping tech companies exploit consumers better. Others would say, actually, let's try and create products which serve people better, they actually want, and widen the perspective around the consumer product, around what they call USX, user experience. But tech companies are using anthropologists a lot in that respect. Microsoft is actually the second biggest employer of anthropologists today. What companies are not doing, though, for the most part, and they should be doing, is using anthropologists to study themselves. A few are. Xerox did for a while with really fascinating results. General Motors did for a while. There are some enlightened companies which are trying to do that, but not nearly enough. And that is the missing gap. And that's what they should be doing. And unfortunately, it takes a very, very brave CEO to do that. The third area, though, where they are using anthropologists, they're using anthropological insights but with a completely different name or label, is in the shift away from traditional Milton Friedman style business theory, which is just shareholder first capitalism, and we're only going to care about the balance sheet and the economic model, which is the ultimate tunnel vision. They're moving from that to what they call stakeholderism or ESG, environmental social governance perspectives, which deliberately try and look beyond the balance sheet and beyond the economic model at things that most business leaders used to ignore, like medical risk, like the environment, like social tensions, like gender abuse, all of the things in the context of a business that traditionally they ignored. And that's actually what I call lateral vision. And oddly enough, it's actually in some ways quite similar to the perspective that anthropologists have been preaching for years, which is about taking a holistic view of the world. So that's, on the issue of politics, I mean, I think that as a journalist, a hefty dose of anthropology is critical. I've often forgotten my anthropology in my work, and whenever I have, I've written some really stupid things. I've just been stupid. One of the classic examples of this, which really slapped me in the face and told me I had to rethink my ideas, was Brexit. Because to me, in my own little elite bubble at the time, or globalist bubble at the time, it seemed self-evident that Brexit was a really stupid idea. And I couldn't believe that anyone would vote for it. And that was my entire arrogance and tunnel vision and blinkered vision of my own, And when Brexit happened, I went, whoa, okay, I've totally misunderstood what's happening in the world. And I spent quite a lot of time trying to talk to people openly and just listen to them about different perspectives and understand why people had such a different view from me. And then it was the same year as the Donald Trump election, 2016. And so in response to that, I actually went and traveled a lot. I was running the American operation of the FT at the time. I went and traveled a lot around America and just tried to listen. And the back of that, what I heard convinced me actually that there was a very, very good chance that Donald Trump would win. But at that stage, most of the elite journalists were still so, disbelieving of that possibility that, to be honest, I didn't write that on the op-ed page of the FT. I wrote it in the weekend FT because that gave me more freedom. And I think today I am in the camp of people who think if Donald Trump gets the Republican nomination, I do think there's a pretty good chance he could win. And I say that not just because of the poll numbers, but because I've sort of immersed myself in the last couple of months in the rhetoric and language and presentation coming out of the Trumpians, which most people haven't. And I can see how addictive it is. And if you immerse yourself in that mindset and read it and watch his presentations, I can really understand what the appeal is for people who feel angry about what's going on in the world. I do not in any way, shape or form like it. Every bit of my being howls in horror, but I'm trying to understand it. And that's one reason why I'm pretty scared.
So, question there?
Thank you. First of all, many congratulations on your new appointment at King's College.
Thank you. Any advice?
Pardon?
Any advice?
Well, I often sit on the wall and have an ice cream in King's College, and I wonder whether you might ever pass by, but so far I've not seen you.
I probably will.
A two-part question. Firstly, how did you create the structure for your very good, excellent new book? I know I have hearing aids, so it's not always easy to hear things, but quite a lot of what you've spoken about tonight is in the book.
Mm-hmm. I have a limited number of ideas. I kind of recycle them a bit.
Really interesting. It's a wonderful book.
Thank you.
Up, guys, because anyone wants to look in, go and get yourself a copy.
Oh, well, thank you very much indeed. You're definitely working on commission, so
Sorry,
thank
we
you.
haven't got the books on sale here, sorry.
So, the structure, it must have taken, I would think, quite a long time to put everything together, because there's lots of references in here, isn't there? And lots of steps along the way in how you put the book together.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much indeed, very kind. I basically worked off the basis of that, making the strange familiar, familiar strange, and social silences model. And I used, as a narrative arc, my own life, which I hated to do, truly hated writing about myself, but I realized that it was the only way to try and communicate a lot of what I was trying to write about, because, as I say, at the end of the day, for better or worse, personal stories are what creates often the most memorable communication. And it's a very difficult line to walk between sounding like you're totally egocentric and trying to communicate effectively.
So
the second part of that question was, if you had one wish, the genie comes down. You did put in your book that if a Martian or a child came down or appeared, what would he see in a certain point in your book. So if a genie gave you one wish that would come true.
Well, apart from having 25-hour days or 8 hours sleep a night, that'll be a good start, or a way to stop jet lag. I mean, fundamentally, I wish from the bottom of my heart that we would learn to embrace tolerance of each other. And I feel that's more important today than ever. I really do. And the other thing I'd say, people sometimes talk about anthropology, people think about culture sometimes as if it was a set of Tupperware boxes. We have British culture, French culture, Italian culture in different boxes, which are sealed and fixed, and you can stack them up on a hierarchy of value. And when people are under pressure, they start otherizing other people. And we see this tragically in the Middle East, where people are living in cultural boxes as if they were Tupperware boxes, fixed and sealed, and you could basically hate everyone in that box because it's different from our box. The reality is that culture is the most glorious spectrum, and it's constantly changing and moving. And it's like a slow-moving river where new bits come in and the banks get muddy. And if only we could stop seeing culture as being like Tupperware boxes, and we have to prove that my culture is better than you, and I want to shun you or kill you or hate you. If only we could see that as humanity we're connected, and cultures are constantly changing and mingling, and we're better for that, that would be my biggest single wish of all.
Had you asked me that question,
Yeah.
I would have said, peace on earth forever and no more conflict.
Well, that's snappier, so definitely.
So we're getting run out of time. There's a question. Yeah. And I've got one online I want to take. I know we're not going to get through them all.
Thank you very much for the conversation. It's really inspiring, actually, and to see the pathway, the journey behind the name, the author. So I am not an anthropologist. I am a sociologist.
Right, fantastic. Well, it's basically the same thing.
And I would love to discuss the sociology of Bruno Latour and the actor network theory, which is everything but top-down. Mm-hmm. But my question is really, I really love to hear your take from the anthropologist and Financial Times reporter point of view of innovation and progress, because those are somehow epistemological virtues of our time and our context. So I would really love to hear how you view them from the anthropology point of view, working in Financial Times.
Okay, very briefly, I went to Davos for the first time in 2007. And what struck me then was that, so-called Davos man and the kind of 18% Davos woman who were there, i.e. the global elite of business leaders and corporate leaders, when I looked around the kind of gigantic tribal gathering that was Davos in the World Economic Forum, what struck me is that back then the global elite sort of had this holy trinity of ideas that underpinned their kind of ideological framework of the world, which was an unquestioning belief that capitalism was good, globalization was good, democracy was good, and innovation was good. And they assumed that it was going to go in one direction and just keep spreading across the world. And it wasn't so much the end of history, to quote Francis Fukuyama, but the unstated assumption was that history was going in one direction and was going to be good. And the story of the time since 2007 is that all of those pillars have been undermined, if not smashed. So democracy has been challenged, and we've seen with tragic consequences, countries become autocracies. Capitalism has been seriously questioned and is shifting towards a very different model from what the 1990s was. Globalization has gone into retreat, and innovation, we've learned, has both a good side and a very dark side. And so I guess what I'd say is that, from a really big picture, social and structural themes today, we're seeing a growing recognition that actually innovation can be good, but it has to be carefully managed and discussed and made transparent. I was speaking today with Professor Martin Rees at a new institute that's being launched to basically look at how you deal with new technological innovations in a safe way and put them in a social context. And that's brilliant. But that wasn't being discussed 20 years ago. And I think the idea of progress is being challenged because people have realized when we look around the world today and the horrors unfolding in the Middle East and Ukraine, and the latter is particularly dear to my heart because I've been to Ukraine a lot, including several times recently. You look at that and you realize that progress is fragile, can be defined in many ways, and we who were fortunate enough to live in the West, in past decades, were grotesquely complacent in every possible sense.
And that perhaps feeds a bit into the question online from Andrea, who says she's curious about other examples where communication is important and has changed big problems, nations, continents.
Well, most of the examples today, sadly, are the bad examples, where we've either had, a lack of communication in relation to all the really important things that geeks are doing in hidden corners that affect us all. So, why did the financial crisis happen in 2008? Was it because a bunch of financial wizards decided to go out there and blow up the world? Were they mad, evil, greedy, or crazy? And the answer is no, they weren't. Some of them were greedy. Maybe a few were a bit mad, but for the most part, the bankers were trapped in these systems which were so prone to tunnel vision they couldn't see what was happening. But the other side of the equation was every person who was taking out a cheap mortgage or cheap credit card in 2005 and 6 was going, yeah, bring it on, but they weren't actually asking or peering into the bowels of how the financial system worked or asking hard questions. It was a bit like the medieval Catholic Church, where you had the priest chanting in Latin and waving the incense and giving out blessings, and the congregation just sat there sort of accepted it all without asking what the Latin meant. So there's plenty of examples of people not asking hard questions and communication being obscured, and we've seen that play out again in the medical sphere. We're seeing it playing out in terms of the whole digital technology world, the kind of ad tech space, where ad tech was, booming for years before anyone asked how ad tech actually worked. You've seen that now with the whole AI debate. So that's an example of lack of communication, and that's absolutely endemic. In terms of, good communication, I guess towards the end, some aspects of the COVID story were better than others. There's really interesting behavioral science stories around COVID and how people did or did not communicate messages. Many governments did a very bad job. Some did a bit better.
Yeah,
I mean, living in New York, I was always stunned by the fact that New York is traditionally seen as one of the most individualistic societies out there, and where traditionally the idea of wearing a mask was seen as a kind of, this is a New York view, a weird kind of Asian thing that no New Yorker would do. And yet somehow the New York authorities, through their messaging, managed to make mask wearing seem like a badge of pride and community responsibility. And one of the fascinating things about New York, having lived in COVID during New York and then having come back to the UK, was in New York City at least, it became really socially unacceptable to not wear a mask, even though masks weren't really mandatory most of the time, and there were no fines. But actually, individualistic New Yorkers embraced masks as a kind of symbol of responsibility to their community. It was quite astonishing how attitudes changed. And they had things like, we are New York strong, wear a mask, or, no mask, forget about it. They literally used the language of Sopranos to sell masks to the population. And I talked to them later. It was a really interesting example because that didn't happen in places like the UK.
No, I remember going...
And of course, in other parts of America, masks became labelled as, an evil progressive plot.
Yes.
And so you had the opposite behaviour.
Well, fascinating. We've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah. And I've not had a chance to be curious about you and your physics background.
Well, you'll have to invite me to King's.
Okay, challenge on. If nothing else, because you are an amazing example of demonstration effect. Talking about demonstration effect, You are an amazing demonstration, in fact, of what women in science and STEM can do. And frankly, if I could clone you, in fact, maybe we'll find someone in the audience who can clone you. I kid not, clone you and put you into every single British school and say, listen, any young girl who wants to be a really respected female scientist, look at you because you've done it. And we need examples of that to inspire the next generation. I mean that.
You should be applauding Gillian.
No, I mean it.
Anyhow, it's been brilliant. I've learnt a lot. Really grateful to you for coming. So can we applaud Gillian, please? There will be drinks in the buttery. Follow the crowd if you don't know where the buttery is. And Gillian will be there. So for those of you who didn't get to ask your question publicly, you might catch her before I whisk her off for dinner.
Okay, well, thank you. And thank you all for listening.